Hello and welcome to the first instalment of the Face the Music podcast. Today we are talking with John Kurlander. Hi John, it's lovely to have you. How's 2022 going for you so far?
Yes, nice to be with you. Yeah, it's going okay so far, all 7 days of it.
That's what we like to hear. So John is here for our Making It in Music mini-series, which is a series in which we talk with industry professionals about their career to date, and we ask them what advice they'd give to industry hopefuls. John has had a pretty amazing career so far. He's spent a lot of time at Abbey Studios, working as a balance engineer and mixer, and he now works freelance, and John has his name on projects such as the Lord of the Rings trilogy and Toto 4. So John, your career to date is absolutely massive, and I think if we had 24 hours, we'd probably only just scratch the surface. So we might as well just jump straight in. You started at Abbey Road at about 16? Or was it 17?
16.
16?
Yeah. What it is now, but you at the time in the 60s, you could leave school at 16. You had an option to. I took O-levels at 16, and then I had the opportunity. I managed to get an interview and get a job, which is a whole other story.
Well, then let's hear the story of how you got your first role at Abbey Road Studios.
Basically, when I was at school, and my school was about 5 minutes walk from Abbey Road, and I lived 1 minute's walk from Abbey Road. So my whole life was like revolved around St. John's Wood. And I would walk past the studios to going to school and coming back from school every day. And when I was 13, my English master at school said, we're going to go to EMI Studios next week, and we're going to record sound effects for a spoken word drama. It was a Shakespearean play that they were doing an album of, and they needed some sound effects for it. So we went to EMI, to Studio 2, and it was the same time that the Beatles were recording the Help album. So we walked in. This is like a bunch of 13-year-old school kids walking into the Beatles studio, and all their gear was set up at the back of the room. And we spent 2 hours there shouting and making the noises, crowd noises, hey, that kind of thing. And at the end of that, the producer said, okay, so you can spend like 5-10 minutes just looking around, look at their instruments and the mics, but don't touch anything. So you can only imagine what a thrill it would have been in the mid-60s to be in this place and do that kind of thing. And I think that's what set it up for me, that I wanted to be in that business when I reached the grand age of 16. So when I was 16 and I did the O-levels, which were okay, but not great, I decided in the summer holidays in August, I wrote to EMI, BBC, and about 10 other studios in London saying, I want to leave school, and are there any vacancies? And EMI was the only place that replied. And they replied and they say, yes, come in for an interview. So we set up an interview, and I went back to school and I said to my teacher, the same teacher that had taken us to do this crowd recording, I said, I've written to all these studios, and if I have any luck at the beginning of the new term. So he said, who did you write to? And I told him. He said, fine, okay. And he didn't say any more. Then I did this interview that took about 10 minutes. And 2 days later, I got a letter offering me the job. So I went back to school, saw my teacher and said, well, they've offered me the job. They want me to start right away. So I'm going to leave school. So I had to go around and get their sign up, return all the books, and go through the process of leaving the school. And I got the job, and I'd been there 6 months. And I came out of the front gate, and my teacher was walking past because like everybody lived in that same area. The school was very close. And he said, so how are you getting on? So we stood in the street and we chatted for about 5-10 minutes. I told him what was going on and blah, blah, blah. And he said, no regrets. I said, no, it's turning out fantastic. So he said, well, that's fantastic. So just give my best wishes to Gus Cook when you see him. Now, Gus Cook was the head of the technical department who later, about a year later, became the manager of the studios. And I said to my teacher, how do you know Gus Cook? And he said, well, he's my next door neighbor and our wives are best friends. And he just smiled and walked off.
So do you think he had any hand in getting you the job?
We'll never know. I'll never know because first of all, I never asked him straight out. And later when Gus became manager, I never asked him. I didn't want to know. It's got to be 99% certain. I decided never to question it.
I think the curiosity would have killed me, but perhaps he didn't want you to know. And I guess that kind of says a lot about his character. So, John, could you tell us a little bit more about your first role at Abbey Road Studios?
The first thing that they did in those days is they would take the new person, new hire, and put them in the tape library. And you would stay there until the next vacancy arrived, when you could then get promoted down to be a studio assistant. It actually had nothing to do with you or your abilities. It was just like some people would go in the tape library and they could be there for 2 years or more. And that was no reflection on them. It was just that there wasn't another vacancy down there. So you got the vacancy before the real vacancy. But it was not a bad idea because first of all, if you were going to be a studio assistant, you needed to know how the system worked and where everything was. So it was really like a acclimatization of the building, of the way that the tapes were written out, the tape boxes were written out, and the labeling and the whole infrastructure of that. And then again, it was like being a runner because they would ask you to deliver tapes and collect them from the studios. So they would say, okay, take these tapes down to Studio 3. And if they don't mind, you could just hang around and watch what's going on. So you don't need to hurry back. And I did that a few times. And it was a very good introduction to the building. And then I started in mid-September of 1967. And by that Christmas, which was only 2.5 months later, I was told, when we come back from the Christmas break, you won't be in the library anymore. You're going to be in the studio. So come the beginning of January, it started a technical training program. I suppose that would be the beginning of my higher education that I missed at school. And they basically taught you what they wanted you to learn. They didn't want people from university courses or online courses. They wanted you to learn the Abbey Road. And that's really why in those days, everybody who was considered for an opening position was 16. I mean, I was 16, Alan Parsons was 16. So everybody was 16 when I started. It really did two things. One, it allowed the studios to train everybody the way they wanted you to do things without other influences coming into the building. It was very establishment from that point of view. I think that, the alternative to EMI studios in those days might have been going to the BBC, and that would have been much the same, the kind of formal training. Whereas now, this kind of thing is done with online courses and university courses. in those days, the bigger studios did it themselves. And I think even the smaller studios did it as well. So there was a big incentive if you wanted to get into the business at that point to seize it early on, because once you're past that magic sweet 16, it was I hate to say it, but in those days, it was almost too late.
So it was a really, really quick turnaround for you at Abbey Road back then. And you've had an amazing career since then, and you're freelance now, yes?
Yes.
And would you mind just spelling out a couple of your career highlights along the way so we can just get a broad view of your career so far?
I think, when I started down on the studio in 67, in exactly 1 year later, I was working with the Beatles. Now it would seem like an incredible honor, like why you chosen it. It turned out that I'd worked with Jeff Emerick and George Martin during my first year. So it was a great honor to be asked to work with them. So I worked with the Beatles. Then I worked with all four of them individually on their first solo albums. The first McCartney one, did a little bit on George Harrison and John Lennon, and Ringo. So all four of them really solo albums. And then, unfortunately, after the Beatles broke up, in the early 70s, there was a little bit of a dip in pop music, and what we were doing at Abbey Road wasn't that amazing. I think the great exception to that was Pink Floyd. I drifted into doing classical recording, and I got my first classical session actually up in Liverpool with the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic. I think that was 1974. So I would have been 21 or 22 by that point, which again was like an amazing opportunity that, how many 22-year-olds get that chance to do a classical recording with a full orchestra. And then we got to the early 80s, and there was a thing in the 80s where there were a lot of rock bands who wanted to add 90-piece symphony orchestra onto their tracks. And it was actually that whole fad was mentioned in that fabulous Spinal Tap movie, where towards the end of the movie they say, "Oh yeah, I think I'd like to put the London Philharmonic on some of my acoustic numbers." Well, that was actually a joke that referred to what was going on in the early 80s. And as far as Abbey Road was concerned, I was doing like the lion's share of that kind of thing. And I worked with Elton John, Ozzy Osbourne, and most notably Toto. That was the big thing in orchestral music at the time. And also I worked with a friend of mine who used to be an EMI engineer called Jeff Jarrett. And we did a couple of series with him. One was Hooked on Classics, which was basically classical music medleys to a very, very basic drum beat, like a disco 4/4 time beat. And then classic rock with the London Symphony Orchestra. So I did those. So I was doing, in the 80s, I was doing a mixture of orchestral music for rock tracks and also real classical music, which I loved as well. So I actually got the opportunity to cross the divide, because when I started there was a huge divide between pop music and classical music. And you'd have pop engineers and classical engineers. And in fact, when I left in 1996, and I don't know whether this is a compliment or not, but they actually needed to hire 2 new people to replace me, one pop and one classical. And at that time, for a long time, I'd wanted to move to America. So it was really the beginning of Abbey Road seriously getting into film scoring in a big way. So I came over to America and did film scoring. It was kind of difficult at the start, actually, because although I was, at the time, I had been the chief engineer of Abbey Road, it still didn't actually mean that much to come over here and say, hey, I was the chief engineer. So it was kind of difficult to get the ball rolling. But then in 2000 and 2001, I went back to London, traveled, not to live. I was living here in the States, but I did Lord of the Rings, which was basically spread over 4 years, from 2000 until 2003. And that arguably might be one of the greatest set of film scores ever written and recorded. So that was kind of difficult to follow.
It is beautifully scored. And I was going to ask about you having a foot in three camps, like you've just talked about, pop, classical, and film, because obviously not a lot of other sound engineers cover such a wide kind of variety. I was wondering if there's one that you'd preferred, or if you'd could go back and do it again, would you do it all the same split? Would you pursue one more? Or was there one that you'd initially set out to do and just kind of got swept up in the others?
I think that, trying to remember what the dates are. No, it's 2019, it's 2022. That's nearly 55 years, right? So if you're going to do this career for 55 years, I think you need a bit of variety. And I think that if somebody would say, well, if you could only choose one or the other, that would be really difficult. And also quite a kind of low boredom threshold. So it's good just to change it around a bit. So, yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Right now, this week and today, I've been working on a score for a Blizzard video game. And today I'm working on a classical recording that I did a while ago. So I'm still, even though I'm here, I'm still doing a little bit.
I came to listen to you talk at Abbey Road's Amplify a little while ago now, and you were talking about working with orchestras. And one thing that really surprised me, although it seems a little obvious looking back, is just how much impact mic setups and the setup of an orchestra seating can change the sound that you record and receive.
Yes. I mean, there's basically two ways to record anything. I mean, I'll say orchestras, but I mean really anything. One is to be like ultra fussy, and I mean really fussy about the setup, the chairs, the positioning, the acoustics, the mic choices and the mic positions and the mic angles. And then there's the other way of just, well, put the mics out, slap it down on tape or slap it down on a file, and then play in the mix. And the way that we were all taught at Abbey Road was the first way. And actually, there's very little that when I'm mixing something, which is like what I'm doing here at my home studio at the moment, it's all a matter of mic selection and positioning. It's all in the planning. And the planning is very important. And I always spend a lot of time at the setup. When I go to a studio, they'll say, well, we'll set it up. You don't need to get here until about an hour before the session. I said, no, that's not doing it. When are you doing the setup? They say, well, doing the setup the night before. So I said, I'll be there. And, I like to be there from when the floor is absolutely clear and we put all the chairs out. And I like to put all the chairs out. And that's basically where the sound that I get is created. It's absolutely true that the response of a mic changes enormously with just, a few inches or a few centimeters. So the problem with that is you have to do it in advance. And if you get it wrong, when the recording starts, especially an orchestral session, you may only have like 2 or 3 minutes, if that maximum, to put it right. And sometimes I've done sessions where you go, oh no, you hear it right on the downbeat at 10 o'clock. Oh no, this isn't working. And you've only got like 2 or 3 minutes to put it right. the way to do that, there's a few ways of mitigating that, which is put out a few options, and then you can choose, option A or option B, which could be, a set of mics. If you don't do that, if you set it up and it's wrong, then you have to resort to the other method of trying to fix it in the mix, which is never, ever, it'll get you something, but it won't be as good. I did a thing a few years ago here in LA where they were doing a charity recording that was raising money for an earthquake victim somewhere. And they had this idea to record the orchestra in one of the scoring stages here. The engineer who tracked it put out 72 mics. And I asked them, why did you put out 72 mics? I said, well, because the studio that we were doing it said we couldn't do any more than that. Would have wanted to put out more. So then they had the idea that because there were eight tracks on the album, they wanted a different mixing engineer to do each track, just so that everybody had a go at contributing to this charity project. And I was sent a track. So this was something that I had not recorded and didn't really know anything about. All I knew is I got a set of files that was 72 mics. And I remember I got the thing on at the weekend, and it was a Saturday morning, and I spent about 4 hours going through each of these 72 mics. After like 4 hours, I thought, okay, there are two that I like the sound of. And that's going to be the mix. And basically, I did the mix just using those two mics only. And I sent it in, and they said, thank you very much. The mix sounds great. By the way, some of the other engineers are taking a little bit longer. So if you need more time to like tweak it a little bit, we have the time. And I said, look, I've chosen the two mics. That's it. There's nothing, there's nothing else to do.
Yeah, sometimes you don't need to go overboard with and just use what you've got.
Yes.
I think another thing that you're quite well known for being a bit of an innovator for is leaving Her Majesty at the end of the Beatles album.
Oh, right. Yes. It's funny how that one story kind of is going to live with you forever. I mean, you want me to tell you that story then?
Yeah, go on. If you're not tired of telling it.
Well, not really, no. This would have been in the summer of 1969, tape opping with Jeff Emerick on the Abbey Road album. And one afternoon and evening, we did rough mixes of the medley, which up until that point, I hadn't really understood what was going on, because as a second engineer, you weren't like party to all the discussions. You just like were there and did what you were told. And as far as I knew, there were all these songs that were very short. Some were a minute, some were 2 minutes or a minute and a half. And I didn't really understand why this album was going to have so many short songs. And they said, right, we're going to do some rough mixes. So we spent the afternoon and early evening doing rough mixes of these very short pieces. Most of the others all went home. It was about 10 o'clock at night. And we said, we're now going to do some cross editors and crossfades. So as tape op, I was actually doing the editing, and a crossfade would basically be you play the end of one song and the beginning of the next on two stereo machines, and copy the result, the crossfade, onto the third machine. So we did all the crossfades, and then Paul said, so all these, and this is honestly the first time I knew anything about it, he said, all these short songs are all going to be joined together to make a medley. And that was the first time I knew what it was going to be. And here is the running order. So did it. put it together. So we'd had each mix of each song and each crossfade to join them up. And we played it through, and it would have been maybe 2:00 in the morning, and we'd been working the whole day. And so everyone was quite tired. And Paul said, that's all great, but just, I don't like Her Majesty said, just get rid of it. And being only 20 seconds long, it's just a small piece of tape. I was given the understanding he just said, throw it away, which I wasn't about to do. What I should have done really was got out the tape that it came from, spool it on, and put it back where it came from instead of on this like new master. But it was very late. We were all very tired and we all wanted to go. So I said, it's going to be easiest if I don't put it back where it came from. I'll just put it at the end of the new master. Because there was actually another rule that I remember. I thought, I know what I can do. I can use the rule that says if a master tape has a track removed from it, you do a decent length, like maybe 20 seconds of red leader tape at the end, and put unwanted track at the end of the album. And I thought that's going to be a quicker and easier way than putting it back where it came from. So I did that, and I wrote on the box, Her Majesty's unwanted track at the end of the album, 20 seconds leader. So Paul had already left by that point, and it was really just Mal Evans, who was his longtime roadie, whose job it was to take the tape away and have a reference acetate lacquer cut of it the next morning at Apple, because they were set up a disc cutting room at Apple Studios. And Malcolm Davis got the tape, and he saw this thing at the end, unwanted track at the end of the album. But he also made a judgment call, which he said, well, if John left it on, I'm going to leave it on. And he did the same thing. You know, he wrote the lacquer and he put unwanted track at the end of the lacquer. And then that lacquer came back to us the next lunchtime. He did it that morning and played it through. And I didn't know, and no one knew, that this thing was still going to be there. But we listened to the medley, and it was quite a important day, because it was the first time any of the Beatles and any of us had actually heard this all the way through. I think everyone realized this might be the last track of their last album, although no one was actually saying it. And so it played through, and there was this huge pregnant pause, and wow, that's it. Wow, amazing. And then Her Majesty just crashes in on the offbeat, because the first note was already still in the medley where I'd cut it out. And they all just loved it, and Paul said, that stays in. So when they, a few weeks later, when we did the final mixes, they just left that rough mix of Her Majesty's as it was, with the first note and the last note missing.
And that's kind of considered to be like the first hidden track, really.
Really, I suppose you could say it was down to laziness. I mean, there have been people who have reconstructed and put it where it was originally. And like most people said, no, it doesn't work.
No, I think you're right. I think you had like a massive impact leaving that hidden track there on that album, an impact on like the whole concept of an album. It became really commonplace to leave a hidden track at the end. And something else that I really wanted to talk to you about, John, was the video game that you played a segment of at the Abbey Road Amplifier sessions. I can't remember the name of it, though.
It was a game called Remember Me. You're talking about the track that we played.
Yes.
Yeah. And that was for a French composer called Olivier de Rivière, who lives in Paris. And I've done a few projects with him. And Olivier believes very, very strongly that the game music should be able to be influenced and controlled by the player. The simple thing is that the sound of the music, the music in the game, is actually controlled by the gameplay of the player, and there are certain modules that are triggered by the play, and that what's on the soundtrack album is only just perhaps a demonstration of what it could be, which is what we played at Abbey Road. And what the music that you actually hear while you're playing the game is never the same twice. And this is something that Olivier has really pioneered and invented the technology to do it. There's a new game coming out in a couple of months called Dying Light 2, and he's done a similar kind of thing where the music is actually controlled by the player and the actions of the game.
So where did the concept for the manipulation of sound in those games come from? Do you know?
Yeah, Olivier invented it.
But do you know what sparked it for him?
I think it's his belief that it's not just, he doesn't believe that game music should just be a piece of composed music that plays. Unlike film music, game music is listened to over and over and over again. People spend hours, way too many hours, like 6-8 hours a night playing the game. So the music's just going to loop round. And most of the games all have like alternate versions that are triggered in. But Olivier took that a step further.
What was it like to work on for you then as a project in comparison to any other project that you've done before?
Well, the thing is, when he first played me the demo, I honestly thought there was something wrong with his iPad because it was glitching and stuttering, and like I thought, no, what's wrong? And he could tell at the meeting, he could tell that I was like questioning what I was hearing. He said, no, that's totally intentional. And then he explained to me how he did it, which was basically he'd set up a series of processing modules, and each one was triggered through the game engine. So you'd have a basic music track that it would be just like punching in a plugin, but it was done in real time as the player was playing the game, triggered by motions in the game. And that's a very simplistic way of putting it. But I'd never heard anything. And that was quite a few. That was about 9 years ago, actually. And it was just like a brilliant thing. And I love to play that track to people.
And then kind of coming full circle at the start, you were talking about what it was like getting into Abbey Road all those years ago, and they wanted somebody who was 16, and the world is a very different place now. So I was wondering, if you were 16 today and you were wanting to go on the same path, what advice would you give yourself, or how would you change your attack to going about becoming a balance engineer?
Well, I get asked this a lot. And, the simple and the most truthful answer, which is also the most unhelpful, is that you have to be incredibly lucky. And I would say that I've been ridiculously lucky right from the beginning. And everything just fell into place for one reason or another. And I realized that doesn't really help anyone. But the only thing is, opportunities do come to people when you don't expect it. You have to be proactive and take those opportunities, right? You can't create them. They will either come or they won't come. And when they do come, you have to have been very well prepared and very serious about what you want to do, and you use that opportunity to maximize it. And when I had the job offer to go and work at Abbey Road when I was 16, could have said, well, I feel a bit, inexperienced. Maybe I should not do it now, and maybe I should finish my A-levels. I didn't realize at the time that would have actually been too late. And my life had taken a completely different course. So I think when there's like little snippets of divine luck come your way, you have to jump on them and say, this is it. This is what I'm being offered. And then you have to take it. And then most importantly, don't screw it up.
Don't screw it up. Okay, good advice. Thanks, John. Unfortunately, this is the end of the podcast, but it's been lovely to have you with us, John. And make sure you stay tuned for the next installment of the Face the Music podcast.
That's it. Okay, we can cut.